Hello, everybody. Chris Hislop from the Montana World Affairs Council, and welcome to another episode of What, So What, Now What, the show where we connect you with an international expert on the issue of the day, and in just 5 minutes, you become the expert. I'm extremely pleased to welcome friend and colleague, Donna Anderson. Dr. Anderson is the Executive Director of the Global Engagement Office at the University of Montana. She's an international education administrator with over 20 years of experience in international higher education. Donna has provided leadership in the areas of education abroad, international partnerships and agreements, international student and scholar services, intensive English language programs, and international student recruitment. Welcome to the show, Donna. How are you?
Oh, thank you, Chris. I'm well. Thanks for having me. How are you?
Well, I'm great, and we're so lucky to have you on this show. As I said, Donna's coming to us from the University of Montana, and to have an expert so close, we really appreciate it. Now, Donna, a lot has happened, over the past 18 months, not the least of which with the pandemic. But I wonder if you could tell our viewers a little bit about the internationalization of international education and where it might be going from here.
Sure, Chris. So, yeah, when we talk about internationalization here on college campuses, we're really talking about higher education's response to globalization and how we have a duty to prepare students to go out and live and work in a world that's interconnected economically through all kinds of people, goods, and services. As you can imagine, the global pandemic really changed things in international higher education. Right when the pandemic hit, we had basically a halt to inbound and outbound international mobility. So that meant our student mobility, which has traditionally been the centerpiece of our internationalization efforts on campuses, also came to a halt. And as it slowly returns, it's likely to continue to form the core of international education for the foreseeable future, but probably less prominently than it has in the past. And I think that the assumption now is that internationalization doesn't necessarily always have to equal mobility. There are other things that have started to not necessarily replace it, but enhance it. Things like virtual exchange. We've done quite a bit of shifting here on campus. For example, our English Language Institute now has virtual programs, hybrid programs for English language learners. They're having virtual homestays, virtual language partners, things like that. And we really kind of moved toward looking at this internationalization at home or on campus or in these virtual spaces.
That's really interesting, Donna. I mean, the same is true for so many other parts of our society. We're all looking to see how we can kind of fill these niches or these changes due to the pandemic and otherwise. Now, tell me though, Donna, why does something like this matter actually to both higher education institutions like the University of Montana and also to students?
Yeah, I think the reason that we have international education hasn't changed, right? Even though the pandemic came through, it kind of put a halt to mobility for a while. We're very slowly starting to reopen, and we can kind of talk about maybe what that looks like as far as enrollments. But the reason for doing this is still very essential. It's about preparing our students to live in this interconnected world. It's honestly, the pandemic really laid bare the importance of the research and the education efforts that we make on our campuses, increased focus on, for example, grand challenges like climate change. Here at the University of Montana, we're doing a lot more looking at those grand challenges and how we can address those through our Global Leadership Initiative and other key programs throughout campus. So I think we know there are issues in the world that can't be solved by any one country. We have to do this together, and therefore international education will always remain critically important.
We've been very fortunate to have a number of guests come on our shows here to talk about the post-pandemic effect of things in general, whether that is the economy, our society, or otherwise. And now we're talking about higher education. these questions are a bit of a crystal ball gaze, Donna, but if you could gaze into your crystal ball and tell us what looms ahead for international higher education, what might we expect to see that is different or unchanged in the future?
I think certainly the efforts that we made during the pandemic toward virtual exchange, toward collaborative online international learning, where you have a class here in Montana and a class, let's say in Japan, collaborating together toward learning outcomes and working together in that virtual space, that's going to continue, and it should continue after the pandemic, because what we found is that those types of virtual engagement experiences are making this global education for all more possible, not just for students who have the means and the ability to travel internationally. So that for sure is predicted to stay in place and continue to grow, the virtual exchange piece. I think the other thing we're finding on the incoming side, so for many years, there was a great reliance from many institutions on international students as bringing in additional revenue to the bottom line. And what we're finding is that, especially with undergraduate international students, there's enough competition out there now, and there's enough realization of what can happen in virtual spaces that we're going to see that market changing. We're going to see maybe fewer students coming to the United States to do full undergraduate degree programs, more students actually now in the graduate market, more students wanting shorter term programs, certificate programs, stackable credits. The other thing that the pandemic did to the international student market is there was a lot of economic impact on those countries that had this growing middle class that were starting to send their students abroad. They really have suffered through the pandemic. And so you're going to see a lot more demand for more affordable international education for students from those countries, particularly the global South.
Well, certainly sounds like, changes afoot and changes ahead in this very important part of our community and in our society. So, Donna, thank you so much for sharing your views on the future of international higher ed with the Montana World Affairs Council. Let me quickly thank our sponsors who help bring this and many other programs to you. That's the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Allegiance, and Stockman Bank. Donna, thank you again so much for joining us today, and thanks to everybody who's viewing. Be well, take care, bye-bye.